let's start with the Indus script itself. In this talk, you will understand what the Indus script is, what its history in terms of the decipherment and everything else that has gone into it, how I deciphered it. We'll look at some interesting inscriptions. We will hopefully you will get a good idea why this decipherment is the correctness of the decipherment, and what are the implications of the decipherment, what it means. So let's start. The Indus script is essentially the earliest inscription is the one you see here in the top right here. This is on a shard of pottery, and this has been dated to 3500 BC. So this is the earliest form of writing. If you look at the other forms of writing, China is 1200 BC, Egypt is 2800 BC, Mesopotamia is 3000 BC when the actual writing started. They had pre-writing, which was essentially a person noting something for only his purpose, but the writing as a society is something where one person can write something and someone else from some other part can easily read it. So as far as those dates are concerned, Indus writing is the oldest. If you look at the letters, they're already advanced. In this 3500 shard, it is already abstracted, which means that the writing probably started much earlier, and based on Phoenician writing, the evolution of writing in the Middle Eastern Semitic scripts, this would mean that the early writing actually was probably invented around 4000 BC. This writing lasted for a long time. It lasted up to 50 CE, that is 50 years after the new era, in megalithic sites in South India. So when we say there's Indus script, I'd like to say Indus script is everywhere. It's not just in Saraswati Valley. It was also found in Sanur in Tamil Nadu in a megalithic site. It's found in many megalithic sites. This is just an example I have put here. Kizadi, recently we found both Indus signs and Brahmi in the same site in 600 BCE, and Chandraketu in West Bengal, we see coins from 300 BCE. So those symbols on the coins are Indus symbols. In Qutub Minar, we find Indus scripts. In Western Iran, in a site, we find Indus scripts, and also in Bet Dwarka, we find these inscriptions. So this script was very widely used in a large region from Iran to Saraswati Valley to Bengal and all the way south to Kiladi, which is in southern India. So what is the Indus script problem? This script has been undeciphered for more than 100 years. And many people say that it's the most deciphered script and with the most number of languages. It has been deciphered as Tamil, Sanskrit. Some people have tried to decipher it as a Middle Eastern language. And recently somebody deciphered it as Japanese. So just because someone deciphered it, it doesn't give any kind of satisfaction that it is the right one. It is because all decipherments are non-falsifiable. So someone just shows a decipherment and said, hey, I figured it out. So there is no way to verify it. Decipherments also cannot be reproduced, like someone else cannot trace the path of decipherment and recreate them. The other issue is that the classifications of the signs, they have, various people have classified it between 360 and 720 signs. So Parpola has about 365, 370, something like that signs. And Epigraphica has about 720 signs. But in reality, there are about 100 base signs, and there are many composite signs, which means, 2 or more signs combined to create other signs. So it all depends on how someone has classified them. So this is an example of what is the state of the decipherment, what looks today. This is Parpola, and he deciphered it as Tamil. And if you see, his longest deciphered inscriptions are only 2 letters long, and he's deciphered about 24. And it's very arbitrary. This double circle, he calls it as rings or bangles. And the three strokes, the three line strokes, he calls them a hearth, and he interprets it as pregnancy bangles. It's very arbitrary. I could, for example, interpret it as nuts and three nuts and squirrel nuts. It wouldn't, my interpretation wouldn't be any better or worse than his. So this is essentially the state of most decipherments, which are try to claim the decipherment is logographic. This is S.R. Rao. He's an archaeologist. He deciphered it as Sanskrit, and the way he did that was he looked at all the signs. He looked at similar signs in Semitic scripts, and he got about 15-20 Semitic scripts symbols that look somewhat similar, and he guessed the rest. This enabled him to decipher much longer scripts. If you can see, there was 5-6 symbols, but still there are a lot of symbols that are undeciphered. So what is our approach to decipherment? One is we analyze the script, we try to figure out how to what's the way to decipher it, and we find a proven and easy to understand method to decipher it. So the key is I didn't want to do something that is my own method, because then I have to kind of prove the method. I wanted something that is well established, and there wouldn't be a lot of questions around it. The other criteria was that I wanted it to be easy to understand for people. The decipherment, I wanted it to be falsifiable. So science is essentially a set of falsifiable statements. And if it's non-falsifiable, like if you saw Parpola's thing, then people will simply, anyone can just randomly create those things. It has no scientific value. So I wanted something that is someone could falsify. So let's go to scripts. If you look at the kinds of scripts that exist, broadly they are in there are three types. One is the first is logographic, which is Chinese. This is a random tweet, on Weibo, which is the Chinese equivalent of Twitter. I just copied the Chinese, and that is essentially, it looks like this. You rarely see any repeated characters, because every sign is a word. And in Chinese, for example, a single symbol is a word. As you can see here, the first symbol at the bottom here is Ren, which is a person. The second is Mu, which is wood. And the third, if you want to take a second to guess what it is, go ahead. It's actually horse. And until I told you it's a horse, you couldn't guess it. But after I tell you it's a horse, you can kind of say, oh yeah, it has 4 legs, it has a hoof, whatever. So the point is, it's very hard to guess what a symbol is based on an abstract rendition of it. So in many Indus decipherments, you will see people saying, oh, this is a hoof, this is a something else, this is a nut, this is a bangle, and from that they try to do a rebus, and because there is no way to determine their first guess itself is correct, the rest of the decipherment essentially is based on this first guess, which for in all probability is completely wrong. The second kind of script is syllabic, and this is actually linear B. I've translated this exact tweet into Greek, and I've rendered it in linear B. Linear B was a script found in a Greek island, and in the beginning, all the scholars were pretty adamant that this cannot be Greek, because of their hypothesis that Greeks were invaders, and they brought the Greek language, and the original language of that region cannot be Greek. But then it was deciphered to be Greek based on one of the words that was only found on that island, and it was a non-expert who guessed that this must be the name of the island, and from that guess of those two or three letters, they were able to decipher the rest of the script. So linear B, a syllabic script, essentially, as you can see in the central section here, has a symbol for a combination of a consonant and a vowel. So for example, here we have 5 in the center here, which is a da, de, di, do, do. And they, you cannot really guess that just by looking at it, what syllable it stands for. And the last is segmental or alphabetic, and I have translated the same tweet into English. And what you see here is that there are a lot of overlaps. So there are a lot of repetitions of symbols. It is very, very easy to see, like in memorize, there are two M's, in will, there are two L's, and so on. It's it's kind of obvious. The Latin alphabet, abjads, these are all considered segmental. So in both segmental and syllabic, you find common letters, you find common endings. So, here I have highlighted in red in the syllabic, that actually stands for sa, and the Greek usually has a lot of words that end in s or os. And of course, linear B doesn't have a symbol for just s, it only has for sa. So when you write it down, you write it as sa. Of course, you see other symbols as well that are repeating. I mean, you could just glance at it, you could just glance your eye on it, and you could see that symbols repeat a lot. Now, although these are three high-level groups, it is very normal to see repetitions of symbols in syllabic and segmental. And when for example, in the linear B, you see the letter S, which is highlighted here, it's sa. And it exists because there is no word for s. You have to use sa, and that you see common endings in syllabic, because many languages tend to have endings in certain common endings. In many languages, in many scripts, you occasionally will have a combination of these. So logographic will essentially have syllabic markers. So Chinese really is logosyllabic. Japanese, for example, uses Chinese letters. They call them kanji, and they also have Roman letters. They write letters in Roman. It's called romaji. Japanese itself has two entirely different systems of syllabic. In alphabetic systems, you can use an emoji that you can consider as a logographic character. So there is no, there's occasionally you will find some signs in writing that are not purely either syllabic, segmental, or logographic. So that's normal. So let's move on to the next slide here. If you look at IndiScript, it's very clear there are a lot of repetitions. You can easily see the fish sign. You can see the square and two numeric markers here that are repeating in many slides, in many inscriptions. So it is very clearly, it is either syllabic or segmental. It is unlikely to be logographic. Logographic is essentially, if you look at logographic, you have a large number of symbols. You have Chinese has 6,000 basic symbols. It has over 40,000 actual symbols. Mayan language has 1,250 or so symbols. You cannot really create a logographic language with as few as 100 to 300 symbols. So this is why a lot of the symbol classifications tries to stretch the symbol count to 700 or more, and so that they can try to analyze it as a logographic. In segmental, you usually have very few, around 20 to 30. For example, the Cyrillic alphabet is 33. In syllabic, you can have essentially, it is a matrix of vowels and consonants. So if you have 10 consonants and 5 vowels, it's about 50. So when we look at this, it's very unlikely that this script is logographic. It is syllabic or segmental. And how do you decipher a message that is just symbols? So such messages are called cryptograms, and people solve thousands of these every day. So these are actual screenshots from Twitter of people creating and solving cryptograms. So if you see here, someone has solved this "Welcome to Moonwood Mill," and based on the pattern of O's, they have figured it as Moonwood. If you look at the dictionary and try to find a word where the second, third, and the two just before the last are the same letter, you actually find only one word, it's cookbook. But based on all the characters, the people can figure out what they stand for. This is called a cryptogram, and this is a very well understood fun. It's like you have crosswords and so on in the newspapers. You also get cryptograms. Now, although this is how cryptograms can use any symbols, what usually happens is in newspapers and so on, they don't create their own symbols. They just use a rearranged alphabet. But the problem is just the same. It's just it's a lot easier to just rearrange an existing alphabet or use numbers or so on. Typically, in a cryptogram, it's a quote by a famous person. This example, this is from Ralph Waldo Emerson. And so this is the cryptogram. The black is the actual puzzle. The blue is the solution. Now, how do you solve this? A lot of this is solved by trial and error. People look at the short words and try to guess it could be a is, be, to, and so on. And then there are ways to solve it. Most people who use regular expressions, what they do is they find a unique pattern. In this example, I'm going to pick this word millennium, and I'm going to pick this, BBRR. It's a double repetition in a word, and I can try to solve it using something called a regular expression. So people who are not in the programming world, for their benefit, I'm just going to explain what a regular expression is. It's essentially a pattern of letters where you can capture the position of each letter and you can refer to it. So here, the ... here in parentheses become 1, 2, 3. And here when I do \3, it just says I'm repeating this letter. So here, if you see LOBB, I'm repeating the second B here. And so on here in all the way to /1, which is the same as the letter L. And I am looking at up here in Cornucopia Dictionary, cc.text is Cornucopia Dictionary. And I see that there's only one word that matches it, and it's millennium. So once I decipher this, I can look at all the characters, all the words which have only one letter missing. So for example, here, BHN, if I do the similar analysis and I find this is let, so N is T, then I can go to here and put the T, and now I just have to guess X, and then I could guess this as minutes. So this QX becomes as, and so on. So this is how you do it. This has been in the this is public domain since I think at least 10 years. In the Perl community, Perl is a programming language for text manipulation. This has been known for over 10 years. So now the reason I chose this is because a long cryptogram, more than 100 letters, is considered unsolvable in two different ways. So you cannot take this and solve it in a different way. Like you cannot get some other message out of this, anything meaningful. Even meaningless you cannot get. You cannot find other words that fit this for the same values of the symbols. It's just highly improbable. Now let's try to see how you would do it with short words, because in IndusScripts you have you don't know where the word boundaries are. There's no spacing. So we will try to solve this in our own made up cryptogram. So here you have these two words, and they have the first two symbols here and the first two symbols in the second one. You're trying to find the value of the anchor symbol. So the way you would do that is you would use the regular expressions and find what matches this pattern. So the two words that match T and H are the and die, and the four words that match A and N are these. So that means this anchor symbol must be the intersection of these two sets, E and Y and ADTY. And that happens to be Y. So you have deciphered it as any and die. So this is essentially it. It's very simple. Now what happens if this intersection doesn't produce a unique value? Well, you need to get one more piece, and then do an intersection over and over and over again. So this is the formalization. As I said, this is a pre-existing technique. This is not something I've invented, but I've just written it formally. The only difference is here, instead of the dot, which represents one letter, we are doing dot plus, which means we are taking a whole string of letters. This will enable us to capture both segmental, syllabic, and occasional logographic characters. So it won't matter to us what kind of script it is, as long as it's not purely logographic. So if you look at the signs, you can see that the signs have evolved over 1500 years. So starting from 3500 to around 1900 BCE, and you can see the abstraction, so it gets more and more abstract. They took a lot of effort to make it very detailed to look like an animal, as a horse in this case. And as time passes, they make it more and more abstract, and eventually it doesn't even look like a horse. So now when Indus people try to, the scholars who try to solve it, try to classify it, it is very arbitrary. So for example, all of these are considered the same symbol. And the real issue is that every rendition, every instance of a symbol is hand carved, and it's as unique as every person's handwriting. So it is very, there is no real way to be objective about it, because it's not a print, it's not a printed system. And if you look at Parpola's classification, the number 81, the second symbol and the fifth symbol and the last symbol, he considers them all the same, but he considers the second symbol in 80 different from the last symbol in 81, which is very odd, because they only differ in the curvature of the last two legs, the ends of the last two legs. So he focuses, he gives more weightage to that rather than everything else here. So now, are they really different? If you look at modern writing, if you look at the different kinds of A's you can write here, highlighted in red on the left side, you can write it in many ways, and your brain automatically figures out what this letter is. So a curvature at the bottom, it doesn't actually, you don't really give weight to it. Human cognition essentially looks at the whole shape and gives uses that as a symbol. So in our example here, the symbols from 286 to 304, they're essentially the same symbol, because they have the same kind of decoration. So they have a little numeric stroke, or 2 strokes or 3 strokes, and or none, as in 301, and the same way above here, and that is unique to this particular shape. So we can classify it as the same symbol. But in reality, you don't want to do the real classification until after you decipher it. You can use things that are very close as a symbol, and you can bank on the fact that if you look at these symbols here on the top right, that there is so much freedom for the for Indus inscriptions to create signs. They have created so many signs that they don't have to worry about creating unique signs based on tiny variations. So the signs themselves are designed to have a lot of freedom in rendition in individual instances. So it is obvious that 80, the first and the last signs are so different, yet they are the same, because they don't have to focus on little things like a line here and a line there. Now, what if the sign identifications are wrong? What if there is something like C and G that look kind of same, but they really are different? And what if the signs that look different are really the same, like this A and this script A? And what if one of the signs is deciphered incorrectly? You see how in our system we are deciphering one sign and then using the decipher to decipher the other sign. What happens if one of them is deciphered incorrectly? So in the cryptogram method, what will happen is the regular expression will stop matching, and your decipherment will hit a dead end, and you have to restart from scratch. So it is a self-correcting method. If something is wrong, it will simply not go anywhere. You will not get any matches in the dictionary. So imagine in the word millennium, you change one of the letters and try to match it, you will get 0 results. That's basically what happens. Now, what language to try? What language could it be? You have to guess the language. So all of this works if you know what the language is. So the right thing to do is try all languages, and whatever is right, it will fit. So what languages did ancient India have? It had Sanskrit, it had some form of Dravidian. Although we say Old Tamil, it really could be closer to Tulu, which is a language in Karnataka. Nihali, which is isolate. It's unlikely isolate is a language, but is a language of such a large area. So, but you could try that. Burushaski is also an isolate in the mountains in Himalayas. These are the only language groups in India that are native. The other languages, Munda and all, came later in Orissa and so on. So how do we do that? We start with 2 signs, and just like in a cryptogram, you have to guess a couple of signs. There are various ways to guess it. Could be brute force, could be just trial and error. And I have guessed it. It's in my paper. My reasoning for guessing. It doesn't matter how you guess it, because if you're wrong, you'll just have to restart it. So we start with this, and we go one by one, and this is how we proceed. So for example, here, using the and the, and using these 3 inscriptions, we figure out that this sign is un. And now you have the un and the and the, you can figure out that the person symbol actually is a. Now you have a and the, you can figure out this symbol is e, and so on. So you can proceed like that, and you do it one by one. The key is that you should only use the previously deciphered signs to decipher new sign. If you see any number here that is greater than the next one, then it's a circular reference. Such a decipherment is not valid. So what you see is over 1500 years, a lot of changes happen to individual signs. Rotation is very common. It is because the inscriptions need to conserve horizontal space. So some symbols get rotated. And in this particular case, even for vertical space, it got the neck got rotated. They get abstracted. So this is an elephant head, this tusk and trunk and the head and the ears of the elephant. Over time, they get abstracted to just the trunk and tusks. So how do we know these are all the same? We simply determine them, we prove them individually. So here is the actual unabstracted portion. And then, every stage we try to solve it. And when we line them up together, you kind of see that it has abstracted over time. So once you have the symbol, we can look up the dictionary and try to find a word that starts with that letter that kind of looks like that shape. And these are the things I have found that kind of look like it. There, in some cases, there's more than one word, like for fish, there is Meena as well. But in many other cases, this is the only obvious word for it. Now, if you try to arrange them instead of the order by which we decipher it, if you arrange it by the sound itself, this is what you see. And for the same sound, what you see is that the words are very, very close. So for the, starts with Tadulya drum, becomes Tadula, then Tandula, and then Tala. So this, and similarly for Bakshatra, Bakshapatra and Bakshatra. And Madara Masta, which is elephant head, eventually becomes Mastya, and then Maya, which is horse. So apparently what's happened is that these symbols have been orally transmitted, and they get a little mutated, they get a little changed. And that is why you have so many symbols. And the base symbols turn out to be only 81. And then there are composites. Composites essentially are read as it started as a space-saving mechanism because there's not a lot of horizontal space. So they started writing it one below the other, and you just read it as 2 symbols. It's very simple to read composite symbols. So some symbols are decorated. Like we saw these line strokes, and usually it's 3 or 4 line strokes. This is the most 1 to 4 line strokes. This is the most common way of decoration. And what they do is, what it does is, these are found typically at the beginning of the inscriptions. And this is a way to indicate that the inscription is read from either left to right or right to left. Most of these, almost all of these are on the right side, which is the first symbol. And occasionally they're in the center, and at that time it is a word boundary marker. So once you have the symbols, once we deciphered all the symbols, if you may have already seen that some of the symbol signs are very close to the Brahmi symbols. So if you arrange them by the same sounds, not by the way the symbols look, but just by the way, this Ga is the Ga for Brahmi, this is the Ja for Brahmi, old Brahmi. And these are on the right, bottom right, these are the symbols for Indus. If you just arrange them, this is what you see. And what you see is pretty much every symbol is not even a derivation, it's almost an exact symbol from Brahmi, from Indus. All Brahmi symbols, except the E here, seem to have come directly from Indus. So now let's look at some interesting inscriptions. So this is the longest inscription. This is a copper plate found in what's today Pakistan, but it's in the Indus region. It's the longest script. When we transcribe it, you essentially, what you get is a verse in Ushnik 7 into 4 meter. Ushnik 7 into 4 is a post-Rigvedic meter. Rigvedic actually, so any 28 letter shlok, verse can be Ushnik. But usually it is the 7 into 4 doesn't appear in Vedas, it appears post Vedas in the Puranic times. So this is what you see. It's essentially a prayer to Soma and Sun. The second one you see here below is the longest seal. This has around 27 signs, and this happens to be a meter in a variant of Gayatri. It's 6 into 3. It's a prayer to the sun. Dholavira signboard. The normal rendition of this is flipped, but this is the actual, is the correct way to read it. It's read from right to left, and it essentially says Raka Vararaka Araras, which means a diamond gem entrance. The Raka is Vararaka is a diamond, Raka is a crystal. So you could just call it diamond entrance, but this is what it reads. This is a Magadha coin, and you could read this as Rayaka, which is a synonym of Ravaka, which represents a weight of 1.2 grams. And Magadha coins is its weight is about 3 Rayakas. There's no inscription here, but there's a picture of a black buck, and as you guys probably are aware, the region where the black buck roams is known as the land fit for sacrificial acts. So apparently the Indus people were, even in those days, this this sentiment was there. So this is essentially Usha Tamra, which is a coppery red dawn. I just is not, it's a very beautifully carved rhinoceros. And one of the signs we have in, one of the seals we have in great detail and color. So this particular inscription has a chariot with spoked wheels on a yoke. So it reads Rai, but the more important thing here is the fact that a spoked chariot with the yoke was very, very old. This is sometime around 2500 BC. This reads Pani Dharana, essentially wedding. So that concept of Pani Dharana as wedding existed back in around, between around 2500 BC. This reads, on the left, it reads Yajas, which is the word for Yajna. And on the right, Shashamani, which is essentially, Shashamana is persons performing the Yajna, and Shashamani is the deity that's been worshipped in the Yajna. This is the famous Pashupati seal, and it reads Asha Sana Mana, which means prayer of the animal sacrifice. So this essentially seems to be associated with the Ashwamedha Yajna, where all these animals are sacrificed. Now this is a look at the various symbols used in the script, and a lot of them seem to be inspired by the altars, Vedic altars. So this is the falcon altar, and this name of the symbol is Shashada, which is a falcon. This is Udbata, which is a turtle, and so on. This is Chakra, and this is called Ratha Chakra anyway. So that seems to be, they have borrowed these because they, that's what they're familiar with. That's what is recognizable. So there are a lot of Indian deities mentioned in the inscriptions. So the left is it says Ravi Riva, which is Sun Shiva, which could mean Sun is Shiva. On the right is it's a long inscription. It's essentially it mentions the sun and Indra. Varana is a name for Indra. Name for Vishnu also exists. Shasana, Vishnu exists as a protector of the sacrifice and so on. So now we've seen all this. The question is, how do you know it's correct? The successfully being able to read so many inscriptions itself is proof of it should be sufficient proof of correct decryption. But if you look at the probability of a single pair of signs giving a 2-syllable word everywhere, it's 38%. So if you at the bottom here, if you look at, hey, how many words can I have next to a ka? There are 11 words, like a 2-syllable word. And out of the total 29 basic signs, when you divide it, it comes to 38%. And the probability of 2 pairs is essentially the square of that. The probability of n pairs is 0.38 to the power n. So when you have a lot of words, when you deciphered around 500 letters, it becomes infinitesimally small. It becomes like a hash collision. So 1 in 1 followed by 100 zeros, something like that. So when you see a word like this, some Sharanagata, 7 symbols, is very, very, very unlikely to occur by randomly assigning variables. So you saw the other decipherments only working with 2 symbols. So finding something that is 7 symbols is extremely unlikely, just even 1 word. Those are measurable probabilities. These are unmeasurably small probabilities, right? So the fact that you can read 50 inscriptions is measurable to 1 in 10 to the power of 100, but reading them meaningfully. So that was just reading them as random words, but this is reading them meaningfully in one theme. Like, it's a theme about it's a religious theme, it's prayer to the sun and all of this. Reading all of them in the same theme is unmeasurably small. I cannot even measure how small this is. It requires a expert in probability to figure that out. And by the technique we have done, getting a nearly 100% match between Brahmi and this is, again, it's an unmeasurably small probability. It cannot happen by design or accident. And the fact that you have something in meter, when you did it sign by sign and it resulted in words in meter, this is, again, very, very tiny probability. It's just unmeasurably small probability. Now, I had some criticisms from people who read it. And one of them, they said, is, the syntax of the language it doesn't have the right vibhakti and so on. This is actually their own claim on the language of 2600 BCE, based on their knowledge of 1500 BCE and 600 BCE grammar. So this essentially is their own claim. It's not a criticism. And there are some, before it was deciphered, people had claims over, the frequency of this letter has to be this much and so on. Frequency changes over time. So we know from the Bible, over 1,000 years, the frequency of letters has changed. New letters have come up, old letters have been dropped and so on. And that is not something you can do before a decipherment, because they don't know which symbol represents what. So for example, Ta has 4 symbols. And if you count them as individual different symbols, then any analysis you do on that is pointless. It doesn't have any value. One of the other criticism I've said is, well, hey, this sign actually is a different sign. And again, I say the same thing. You cannot make that before decipherment. All these are not criticisms. They're all claims. And the method itself, as I said, it's not my own. It's already existent. The actual decipher, the step-by-step, you see where every sign is deciphered. No one has made any criticism or refutations of those. So that's what the situation is. So is this falsifiable? So falsifiability is very important, because that proves that something like this is a science and something that you can quote and build on for other contributions. So what anyone can do to falsify this is take another dictionary. So I have taken the Sanskrit dictionary, but you can take any other dictionary, English or Arabic or Korean, Japanese, anything, and follow the same steps. You can indeed follow the exact same sequence of symbols that I have solved, and then try to create similar good explanation as to why there are allograms. So like we saw with Tandula and so on.
Your audio went off for about a minute. Could you just repeat the last 4-5 lines again?
Sure. So the way to refute this is very simple. Take any other dictionary and try to decipher the symbols in that language. So you just need a dictionary and you need a weekend, and you can try to prove that this actually, this doesn't work. I can create something similar in a different language. And in such a decipherment, you should have values for all the symbols. You should have a good explanation for the allograms, which is, like you saw for Tha, you had Tadula, Tandula, and so on. You need a good explanation as to why all these symbols have the same sounds. You need to be able to read the longest 15 inscriptions meaningfully, not just like donkey, moon, bark. It's, it has to be meaningful to the reader. It would be good if the largest inscriptions are in some kind of classical meter. If it's Arabic, it has to be in classical Arabic meter, and so on. Religious. So essentially, something that looks like this. Then then you can say it's falsified. And people have tried it. They could not move beyond 2 or 3 signs in any other language. So I'd just like to discuss the implications of this decipherment. The first implication is that IE languages originated in the Indian subcontinent, because we know that this writing is invented around 4000 BC. It's definitely attested from 3500 BC. So whatever happened in steppes or wherever in 2000 BC, it's irrelevant. It doesn't impact us anymore. We also see from the references to Vedic concepts, the deities and so on, that the culture is continuous from IVC. Whenever IVC was reasonably urbanized, I'm putting a conservative date of 7000 BC. It could be earlier. We know Harappan civilization is Vedic related. And one more thing is in the derivation, you guys really should read the paper for more details. We cannot pack everything in here. But the couple of symbols, the Un symbol, the Jar symbol, it is essentially a proto-Anuswara, right? And we see that in the Qutub pillar inscription, instead of Pramshu, it's written Pransu. So that usage of Un as the Anuswara instead of existed until the time the Qutub inscription was made. So you see a lot of attestations for the Indus script in many places, and all of them pretty much they support this decipherment. So at this point, I think we can open it for questions.
My question is actually with regard to what I feel is also might be a serious implication, the connections that you've drawn between the symbols that you have seen and deciphered in Indus Valley with Brahmi. That connection is actually, I feel, I'm not an expert, but I feel that might actually help also bridge this whole Aryan-Dravidian divide issue, which tries to show Aryan Dravidian north-south as separate and so on, rather than as simultaneous or contiguous. So my question is, one, have you done any additional work on this, on the Brahmi aspect? And two, what is the current research going on? Is there, like in official circles, and by the official bodies and concerned people, more work going on to decipher and to draw connections and linkages so that we get a complete picture of our civilization? That's
Right. Yeah, the Brahmi is so essentially Brahmi is standardized Indus, and as you saw in Kiladi, the both writing systems were in vogue, and essentially what happened was the language changes. So in the original Indus language, we believe that the the aspirations and the unaspirated had not yet differentiated. The retroflex had not differentiated, and over time it differentiated, and they had to standardize the symbols and give different values, different signs for different values. And the so that is as far as the Indus to Brahmi is concerned. I don't really see Brahmi as anything other than standardizing symbols, because they are exactly the same symbols, except for like E and U. Everything else is exactly the same symbol. Secondly, in terms of South India and so on, there is work being done by Igor Tonyan Balyayev, who posits that the Dravidian branch separated from Indo-European very early, went to Central and South India, and then it reemerged, and that is why it is so similar in terms of phonology, grammar, the noun cases, really everything. The even borrowings. So I think that is a lot of that has been kind of has been given supporting evidence by my decipherment. I'm sure that more work will go on. I will also be doing some work to look into that. Recently, there's a lot of genetic evidence that supports this particular view. So essentially, just like say, let's say Kannada split into 2 or 3 dialects, like there's North Karnataka and South Karnataka. So if that happens for a long time, then you will see differences. So language group itself is a very long discussion. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but just to give a short summary, language groups require a long time of isolation, more than 10,000 years. So we know that because of Japanese and North and South American languages, it takes around 20,000 years. So Dravidian is not isolated long enough to be that different. That is why we find so many similarities. It's only been isolated for like 4,000-5,000 years. So I wouldn't say that it's different. It's just a different. It's just sufficiently different that you can try to make a claim it's a different language family, but it's not. It's not really that. I'm sorry, I forgot your second question. Is someone else doing research? Yes, a lot of research is occurring on IndusScript. I don't believe that you can have any other value for any other letter than what I've done, simply because it is provably correct. And if you change maybe the letters that don't have high frequency, there are some symbols that occur for 5 times, 4 times. Those you may be able to find a different value that still fits meaningfully. But anything that occurs 10 times, if you change it, try to use a different letter, most readings will break. They will either, you won't be able to create words, or the words will become meaningless. It will be like dog, moon, bark. It won't make any sense.
So I have 2 questions. The first one is that you have guessed with this ta and da. So, I mean, how is that possible? And the thing is that, what about numbers? So this very important point in S.R. Rao's inscription, there were 3 things, ananan, that you deciphered as ananan, but it could have been also 555 or something like that, right? So it is so the numbers are completely absent from this decipherment. Why is that? And the last question is a little bit technical. That 38%, how did you derive that? I probably missed it. But the more important question is, what about numbers and how did you get the initial guess?
Okay, so numbers and initial guess, these are your 2 questions. So numbers, essentially, what we saw is that the numbers just use their first sound of the number, and that's essentially what they did. And the way it evolved is that when they started running out of space, they started trying to create symbols at the end of the inscriptions that can stand for more complex sounds. So for V, they used 2 marks. which is V is 2 in Sanskrit. And once they started that, then for the sake of consistency, they started using other numeric signs to stand for their own values. Have they written any things that are like number? Yes, they do have Eka. Like there's an inscription which says Dada Ekapad, which means gift of Shiva. And there they have Eka, but it's spelled out as A and Ka. That's the first one. Second one, initial guesses. Initial guess, actually, it's a pretty complicated thing. The first one is, if you look at the and the, they are essentially identical to Brahmi. So you can just guess based on that. And the initial guess, as I said, doesn't matter. You could do it through brute force or anything else. But in the paper, what I've explained is there's a sign, there's an inscription that says Dada Dada Danta, which is thunderous sand. You can read it as Dada Danta. You can read it any way you want. It doesn't matter, because all you need is a way to guess the first symbol. Okay. So essentially that's what I've done. And Ananan, the reason I've done Ananan is that it is actually also a kind of a prayer. It's actually a kind of a, it sounds like something that someone would write as a laudatory thing. And the 38% essentially is, if you look at the any random symbol and you give it any value, and the chances of a neighboring symbol matching a word, not a meaningful word, just a word, is simply the number of available words with that letter in that position with the number of symbols. So if you divide them, so roughly it comes to around 38%. So in some cases it's much less, it's 5%, 2%, 1%, and one or two places it is more. It can be 40 or 41%. But I would be, as a kind of a general measure, as a kind of a conservative measure, I've taken 38%.
So my first question is, have you made an attempt to reach out to academia, especially at least in India, to get their views on it? Because somehow, this has to become mainstream, and this is such a big breakthrough. And I had a second question about the Indo-European homeland. So how did you conclude from this decipherment that India is the Indo-European homeland? Because that could still be further back in time, right? So even if you're saying that 4000 BC, we have these scripts, it could still further be back in, say, 6000 BC, because that's the theory of Max Planck Institute, 6000 BC Iran. So how did you conclude that? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, first about academia. Yes, I have reached out to Western academia. And as I said, their objections are essentially claims. And they have not actually, apparently, I was pretty disappointed. They didn't actually read the paper or understood it. They didn't seem to understand what a cryptogram is, why the initial guesses can be, brute force or arbitrary. They did not essentially find an issue with the decipherment, but they found issue with things like, why would they write this? Things like that. It's just completely, essentially dictating what the Indus people should write, and they're upset that it's Sanskrit, and they don't understand that you have to try every language, and the language that fits his works. So, and these are prestigious journals, and the reviewers didn't really seem to understand the paper itself. So that is one. The second is Indian. I think I will certainly approach them, as I'm not an academic. I don't care about academic glory or anything like that. I just, this is just a nice, difficult problem for me to solve. And once I've solved it, I've put it out there. I want to let the universe take over. But we will try to promote this among the people by creating, automated translations, software that can automatically translate and so on. So because then it's pretty much obvious that it's a real decipherment. And your other question was about homeland. And homeland, see, the homeland question really requires input from multiple streams of multiple disciplines of science. Okay, so linguistics is one, and this is a very solid proof, and this by itself I think is enough. But there's also work being done on DNA, and it's based on this David Reich's database of DNA, and what it appears to be preliminary, I just want to say it's preliminary, is that the migration into Europe took place from BMAC, bacteria marginal complex. And we're still working on that. There's a team working on that. When I say we, it's not me, but there's a team working on that. And once that becomes a little more mainstream, maybe we can have another talk and discuss those.
Naive questions, if you might forgive my naiveness. One is you talked about a few long inscriptions that you kind of like deciphered. Is that the limited amount of long inscriptions available in Harappa? Do we have more that is kind of not accessible to you, or is that all? So that's the first question. The second question I have is, in terms of language, Brahmi was used to write not just Sanskrit, but also other languages and all of that. So in terms of language, is this from this, are you able to make out, okay, are these inscriptions closer to Vedic language or the later classical Sanskrit language? Because from this, I'm not able to actually make out either. So I just thought I'll get your opinion on that.
Right. All right. So the number of inscriptions, these are the longest. As I said, the first, the first two are long enough that they are actually verses. And generally after that, you have, between, 20 something to, 10 symbols. And the top 50 are around, after you cross the longest 50, it's around 9 symbols, 9 signs per inscription. So we don't have a lot of long inscriptions. If we had long inscriptions, it would have been a lot, it would be a lot simpler to decipher it. But we have short inscriptions, and fortunately, because we have so many short inscriptions, we can use the regular expressions method. And your second question is about Brahmi. Does it mean, so a script can be used, with modifications for any language. So you see, cuneiform was used for Greek, it was used for Semitic scripts, it was used for Hittite. Similarly, if you have Latin, it's used for European languages, both Southern European and Northern European, and it's used in Vietnamese and so on. Even for Turkish now uses. So script doesn't imply that it's from the same language family or anything like that. It's just a technology, and people who don't have the technology will simply borrow the technology.
One thing I want to know, is there any study made whether these symbols are quite matching with the other contemporary civilizations of that time? Is there any similarity in symbols?
Right. No, there's, for Indus symbols, I think there have been studies. Indus symbols are so varied. There's, you can find 2 or 3 symbols that match something in Egyptian or something in Phoenician or something like that. But in the Semitic scripts, most of the number of symbols is only about 22, 23. Whereas in Indus, you have, depending on the classification, you have, 100 to 700, depending on how you classify it. So there is no real point in comparing it. But yes, the basic geometric stuff you find everywhere, line, circle, like something like a wheel, something like a fork. Those are very common things that all populations will use. So there is so even, for example, in linear B, you have that some symbols that look like Indus symbols, but I don't think that is in any way meaningful.
So my question concerns, first of all, a pretty nice talk. Now, why is it that we have so many like distinct symbols for representing the same syllable? For example, for ka or kha, you have given 15. For na, I can see there are 10. Now, in scripts that do have such a multiplicity, let's take, for example, the Sumerian cuneiform or the Egyptian hieroglyphs. That's because they used to be ideograms or pictograms, which then later got adopted for their sound value. So could we posit something similar for
right? Yeah, I
your
already covered
discovery
that.
as well?
Right, I already covered that in the talk. Essentially, the there are two forces here. One is the allograms themselves, the other is the variants of an allogram. The allograms occurred because the names of the allograms were transmitted orally and got mutated, right? So, Tardolia became Tardula, and Tardolia is a drum, Tardula is a fighter or a warrior. So that's why you have two, signs for it. And then over time, over 1500 years, there are, the signs got more and more abstract. So they became different. So that is why you have so many sounds for it. And some of the signs essentially got mirrored. Okay, because when you carve a seal, you are carving the mirror of it. And sometimes if you forget to carve the mirrored image, then that becomes another sign. So that is essentially how you got so many signs.
You mentioned in your talk the Semitic family. Does it include the Aramaic and the Phoenician, on which in the internet it says the Brahmi script was modeled? And the Indus Valley script and the Harappan script, are they coterminous? Are they referring to the same script?
Yeah, I couldn't follow the question completely. There's no relation between Semitic scripts and Indus script. Indus script precedes all the Semitic scripts by a few hundred years. I'm sorry, what's your other question?
See, the Aramaic was the language in which, script and language in which the first Bible was compiled.
Right.
Is when you browse the internet, it says Brahmi was modeled on the Aramaic and the Phoenician.
Yeah, that's an unattested statement. It's a guess.
Correct.
And if you look at how they have claimed the evolution, if you make sufficient changes to a symbol, like 4 or 5 stages of changes, you can derive any script from any other script. But if you look at the Indus symbols and the Brahmi symbols, you don't have to do any changes. They're pretty much identical with just minor rotation and so on.
Is it, I'm working or trying to help Dr. Kalyan Ramanji in Chennai, who's done a great job in deciphering of Indus Valley script. Are you in touch with him by any chance?
We have tweeted on, we have tweeted at each other, yes.
Okay, just wanted to know, I'm trying to find some people on artificial intelligence and machine learning who could help him decipher, because he has already done about 8,000 words of the Indus Valley, script. So is it, so I'm trying to see if there's somebody out there who's interested in that.
Right. So Kalyan's decipherment is logographic, and as I said, he looks at a thing and says, "Oh, this is a hoof, and it sounds like this. Therefore, it sounds like tin." So this kind of stuff is completely non-falsifiable, and it's very arbitrary. And anyone could claim that anything looks like anything, and that anything sounds like something else, and therefore that stands for the symbol. So such a decipherment has no value without a Rosetta Stone, which confirms that this symbol, is the same value because of it is written into common language. So I would, that's not an approach that I find is scientific.